The diner on the edge of Elk City, Oklahoma was called Rosie's, and it had been called Rosie's since 1974, and the sign out front had lost its apostrophe sometime in the 90s, and no one had replaced it because by then, everyone in Kiowa County knew it was Rosie's and strangers could figure it out. The temperature that February morning was 11 degrees, and the wind off the plains was the kind that finds you from three directions at once. And Sergeant Dario Vance had stopped because the coffee was good and the alternative was the highway, and when he got out of the truck and went around to let Callie out, the dog stopped. She stood in the door of the cab and faced the alley that ran along the right side of the diner, and she did not move. Not toward the alley and not back into the truck. She simply stopped, ears forward, nose working, with the absolute stillness of an animal that has located something it has not yet decided how to characterize. Dario stood in 11-degree wind and waited, because he had learned over 3 years with Callie that her stillness was always more informative than his motion. And then he heard it. Low, irregular, the sound of someone moving in a small space with the economy of a person who has lived in a small space long enough to stop resenting its dimensions. What that Marine and his canine found in that alley behind Rosie's Diner in Elk City, Oklahoma before that morning was over would uncover a secret that a quiet man had been sitting on for 2 years, a secret that certain people would have preferred the cold and the distance and the ordinary invisibility of an old man behind a diner to keep buried for good. If this is your first time here, stay with me. This channel tells these stories, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. Dario Vance was 31 and had been out of the Corps for 14 months and was driving from Lawton to Amarillo for reasons he had not yet finished explaining to himself, which was the honest way to account for the fact that he had gotten into the truck that morning before he had a reason, and the reason had not fully arrived by the time he reached Elk City. He was from Durant, in the southeastern corner of Oklahoma, the son of a man who drove long-haul freight and a woman who kept the books for 3 small businesses in Bryan County. And he had grown up understanding that the work you do with your hands is not separate from the person you are, that the way a man treats a job he could do badly without anyone knowing is the truest thing about him. He had joined at 20 because he wanted to know what he was made of in a situation that would tell him honestly, and he had learned in Helmand, in the particular calculus of keeping men alive in terrain that did not care, that what he was made of was adequate to the situation, which was all he had asked, and which he had carried home with the specific dignity of a man who does not overclaim. He was driving to Amarillo to not be sure of it somewhere new. Callie was a 6-year-old golden retriever mix, 64 pounds, the color of winter wheat, with one brown eye and one eye that was amber, going toward gold, and a way of expressing opinion through her ears that Dario had learned to read the way you learn to read weather, imprecisely but usefully. She had been a failed guide dog candidate, washed out of the program in Tulsa not for any deficiency in intelligence or temperament, but because she had a tendency to stop and investigate things that were not on the route, which the guide dog program considered a liability, and Dario considered a gift. She had been placed with him through a Veterans Companion Animal program in Norman 4 months after he got out, and she had organized herself into his life with the practical thoroughness of someone who has assessed a situation and decided to be useful in it. She was the dog who noticed what Dario missed, and she missed very little. She was still standing in the truck door, facing the alley. Dario went around the front of the truck and looked down the alley. It ran the length of the diner and ended at a cinder block wall and smelled of grease and cold and something else. Wood smoke, faint, the kind that comes from a small contained source. Against the back wall, beside the diner's kitchen exhaust vent where the air would be warmest, there was a structure that was not a structure, a sleeping arrangement, carefully made, a canvas tarp rigged between a drain pipe and a nail in the cinder block, a sleeping bag visible at the near edge, boots placed with precision outside the tarp's overhang, and sitting on an overturned milk crate beside the boots, with a paper cup in both hands, and his face turned slightly away from the wind that came down the alley, was an old man. Not old in the abstract, old in the specific, the deliberate way he held the cup, the careful economy of his posture, the particular stillness of a body that has learned to conserve heat by not wasting motion. Callie went down the alley at a walk, not a run, and sat down in front of the man and looked at him. The man looked at Dario. "I'm not bothering anybody," the man said. His voice was steady, not defensive, factual, the voice of a man who has said this before and is prepared to say it again. "I know," Dario said. She stopped. I followed her. The man looked at Callie for a moment. She's not an aggressive dog. She's a noticing dog. Something in the man's face shifted. Slight. 1 degree, the shift that happens when a stranger says something that is unexpectedly accurate. Come out of the wind, then, he said. There's another crate. His name was Emmett Suggs. He was 84 years old. He had been living in the alley behind Rosie's diner for 2 months. He said this without apology and without self-pity, in the same factual voice, because Emmett Suggs was a man who stated the facts of a situation without ornamentation. A habit built across 20 years as a cost estimator in Oklahoma City, where saying clearly what something would cost without making it more or less than it was had been the single most valuable skill he possessed. He had moved back to Elk City because his wife Loretta had wanted to be near her sister, and what was Loretta's was his, which was the whole architecture of a 52-year marriage. Loretta had died 2 years ago. The sister had moved to Tulsa 6 months after that. He had a daughter named Brenda in Dallas who had not known he was in the alley. He had been in the alley because of his son-in-law. Callie had put herself beside Emmett's crate in the specific way she put herself beside people she had assessed and decided about, her shoulder against his leg, her face pointed out toward the alley entrance, as if she had taken a position of general vigilance on his behalf without being asked and without making anything of it. Emmett looked at her, then he looked at Dario. You want to ask why? He said. Go ahead and ask. I was going to ask one thing first, Dario said. Have you eaten? Emmett was quiet for a moment. Rosie's lets me work a couple hours in the morning. Dishes. I eat before the rush. Then I'll have coffee with you, if that's all right, Dario said. And then you can tell me or not tell me. Emmett looked at him for a moment with the evaluation of a man who has had 84 years to develop a reading of strangers and is applying it now. You're a veteran, he said, 14 months out. Branch? Marines. Emmett nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man cataloging information. Army, he said. Vietnam era. I was a specialist in the 101st. Never saw combat. I was stateside for the worst of it, but I was there. That counts, Dario said. Emmett looked at him for another moment. Not everyone thinks so. I think so. The old man was quiet for a beat. Then he said, Go get your coffee. I'll be here. They sat in the alley for 40 minutes. The wind came down from the north in irregular gusts, and Callie pressed closer to Emmett's leg each time it arrived and leaned away each time it passed, and Emmett's hand rested on her back in a way that was automatic, the way a man's hand rests on a dog when the dog has been there long enough that the hand forgets to decide. He talked in the way a man talks when the thing he is saying has not been said to another person, and the act of saying it out loud is itself a kind of discovery, stopping, reconsidering, correcting himself, going back. The shape of it came out slowly. Brenda's husband was named Tim Garber. He was 51, ran a flooring business in Dallas, and had the specific competence of a man who knew his field exactly and expected the same precision from the world that he applied to it. When Loretta died, Tim had driven up to help Emmett settle the estate, and the help had been genuine. Tim was good at that kind of thing, and Emmett had been grateful in the raw way you are grateful when someone handles the mechanics of a loss while you are still inside it. During that week, Tim had noticed that the house on Chestnut Street needed work. The roof was coming due. The furnace was original. Tim had a friend who did investment property, and the friend said the smart play was to sell now while the market was good and put the money somewhere liquid because a house of that age was going to start costing more than it returned. Emmett had said he wanted to think about it. Tim had come back 3 times. Brenda had come with him on the second visit. She had sat across from her father at Loretta's kitchen table and said, quietly and with what Emmett believed was genuine care, that Tim knew about these things and that she trusted Tim's judgment, and she thought her father should too. Emmett had said he would think about it. On the 3rd visit, Tim had brought the papers. The sale had closed in November. A fair price, Tim had said. The buyer was a holding company with a Tulsa address. Emmett had received a check for the equity minus the costs Tim had itemized, realtor fees, the cost estimate for the deferred maintenance Tim said had been factored into the offer, a management fee for handling the transaction. The number Emmett received was significantly smaller than the number he had expected. When he asked about the difference, Tim said the market had adjusted. When Emmett asked to see the itemized costs, Tim said he'd send them. He had not sent them. Emmett had taken a room at the motel on the highway. In January, it cost more than the money he had left in the month, and he had not called Brenda because calling Brenda meant talking to Tim, and he had not yet worked out what he was going to say to Tim. He had found the alley in the way you find things when you were looking for somewhere warm and out of the wind. He had made it work because making things work was what he knew how to do. He had been in the alley for 2 months, sitting on the question he had not yet answered, whether what Tim had done was something Tim had known he was doing. Have you ever watched someone you loved trust the wrong person? Not because they were foolish, but because they came from a time when trust was what you gave family? Tell me about them in the comments. They deserve to be here. Dario said nothing for a moment after Emmett finished. The wind came down the alley and Callie leaned against the old man's leg, and Emmett's hand on her back did not move. Do you still have the closing documents? Dario asked. I have everything, Emmett said. He reached behind the milk crate and produced, from inside a weatherproof bag wedged between the drain pipe and the wall, a manila envelope. I kept everything. I've always kept everything. Of course he had. 20 years as a cost estimator, the man who stated what things would cost without making them more or less than they were. Of course he had the documents. Dario took the envelope and read through the sale documents the way he read anything important, slowly, not moving on until he understood. He had not studied real estate law, but 14 months at loose ends had meant a lot of reading, and he had read enough to recognize, after 20 minutes in the alley cold, that the management fee Tim had deducted was not itemized in the original listing agreement, that the holding company with the Tulsa address had filed its articles of incorporation 11 months ago, and that the buyer's representative on the closing documents was a man whose last name was Garber. He looked up. Tim's brother, Emmett said. He had been watching Dario read. I found that part 2 weeks ago. I've been trying to understand what it means. It means Tim bought your house, Dario said. He said it quietly. He did not cushion it because Emmett was not a man who needed cushioning. He needed the fact, plainly stated. Through his brother's holding company, he managed the transaction, set the terms, took a fee for the management, and bought the property at a price he controlled. He told me it was a fair price, he said. He told you what benefited him, Dario said. Emmett looked at the alley wall. He looked at it for a long time, with the expression of a man who has been working on a problem in the dark and has just been handed a light and is looking at what the light shows and finding that it is both worse and better than the dark. Worse because of what it reveals, better because the not knowing is over. Brenda doesn't know, he said. It was not a question. I don't know what Brenda knows, Dario said, but I think you need to call her before anything else happens. I didn't want to be the one who... Emmett stopped, started again. She loves him. I know, Dario said. Call her anyway. Dario went into Rosie's and used the diner's phone. The owner, a woman named Gloria, who had run the place since her mother retired in 2003 and who had been sliding food out the back to Emmett twice a day for 6 weeks and had told herself it was something else, and called the Oklahoma Legal Aid Society's elder law line and described the transaction in specific terms and was told that what he described was consistent with a self-dealing violation in a fiduciary transaction and that a staff attorney would call him back within the hour. Then he called the Oklahoma Department of Securities and described the holding company and the transaction timeline. Because the 11-month-old LLC and the family member transaction had a shape he wanted someone official to look at. Gloria made Emmett breakfast while they waited. She looked at Dario and said, I should have done something sooner. Dario said, You kept him warm. That's not nothing. She looked at the alley door and said, He never asked for a thing. Dario said, That's usually how you can tell. Brenda Garber drove up from Dallas in 5 hours and 40 minutes, which meant she had left within 10 minutes of the call. She came through Rosie's front door and looked at her father sitting in a booth with a dog beside him and a young man across from him. And the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has just understood several things at once and is working through them in real time. She sat across from her father and took his hands in hers and said, Dad, why didn't you call me? And Emmett said, I didn't know how. And Brenda said, You call me. Tim Garber arrived 2 hours after Brenda. He had not been called. He had been tracking Brenda's location through the family account on her phone, which was a thing Brenda had not known he was doing, and which she knew now because he arrived knowing exactly where she was. He came through the door of Rosie's and read the room and selected the face of a man who was surprised and concerned. He was in his early 50s, in a good jacket, with the groomed competence of a man who makes good impressions in rooms, and had been doing it long enough that it was nearly automatic. He looked at Emmett, he looked at Brenda, he looked at Dario, whom he did not know, and at the envelope open on the table, and at Callie, who had risen from beside Emmett when the door opened. Callie did not bark. She stationed herself between Tim and the booth, and the sound from her was low and continuous, and without variation, the sound of a resolution already reached. Not a warning issued, but a position declared. The difference between a gate that might open and a wall that will not. Her amber gold eye and her brown eye were both on Tim, and she was not looking away from him, and she was not going to. Tim looked at the dog for a long moment. He took a step toward Brenda. Callie took a step forward. Her weight dropped slightly onto her front feet. The sound did not change. Tim stopped. "Brenda," he said. He used the careful voice. Warm, slightly puzzled, the voice he used when she was being unreasonable. "What's going on? Your dad called you upset. That's understandable, but let's—" "I see the closing documents, Tim," Brenda said. She had not taken her eyes off her father's hands since she sat down. She raised them now, and her voice was the voice of a woman sorting through what she has just understood and reporting on the sort as it happens, clearly and without excess. "I see your brother's name. I see the LLC. I see the fee you charged my father to sell him a house you bought." Tim looked at the documents on the table. Something moved through his expression. Rapid, complicated, the machinery of a man calculating which explanation to deploy and finding in this particular room that none of the explanations have a room to land in. "It was a legitimate transaction," he said. "I disclosed." "You told him the market had adjusted," Dario said, from across the table. His voice was quiet and even and without anything in it that wasn't necessary. He asked for itemized cost. "You didn't send them. He received 63 cents on the dollar for a property you controlled the sale of through a company your brother owns. That's what the documents say." Tim looked at Dario. "Who are you?" "I asked your father-in-law one question this morning," Dario said. "Whether he'd eaten." The room was quiet. Gloria behind the counter had stopped moving. "He hadn't," Dario said. "He'd been in the alley for 2 months." Tim looked at Emmett, and Emmett looked back at him with the full, direct, unornamented gaze of a man who spent 20 years saying what things cost without making them more or less than they were, and who was now applying that same practice to a different kind of accounting. "You told me to trust you," Emmett said. He said it quietly, with no more weight than the fact required and no less. "You told me to trust you." The table held it. Brenda held it. Gloria held it. Callie did not move from where she stood until Tim stepped back from the table and then back again and turned and went to the door. She watched him to the threshold. She watched the door close behind him. She watched the window until his car was gone from the lot. Then she walked back to Emmett and put her head in his lap. Emmett held it there with both hands. The elder law attorney called at 2 in the afternoon. The transaction, she said, had several features warranting examination. The self-dealing structure, the undisclosed relationship between Tim and the buyer entity, the management fee extracted without clear authorization. She could not promise outcomes. She said the shape of it was the shape of things that tended to move forward. Brenda found a rental house in Elk City within the week. It was small and cost less than she'd expected, and she drove up from Dallas with 2 carloads of things and did not explain to Tim in advance what she was doing. And when she arrived, she helped her father carry his weatherproof bag and his sleeping bag and his boots from the alley behind Rosie's into a house with a furnace that worked and a lock he held the key to. The legal matter took time. It moved slowly, which was fine because Emmett had somewhere to live while it moved. The holding company's records were subpoenaed. Tim Garber hired an attorney. Whether the house would be recovered or the equity restored through other means was still being determined a year later. What was not in question was that Emmett Suggs ate breakfast at Rosie's on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, at a table by the window, and that Gloria charged him half price for it and he left a full tip because he was not a man who shorted the person who brought him his food. He started a kitchen garden in April, The rental had a south-facing yard and decent soil, and there was something in the act of putting seeds in ground that had nothing to do with optimism and everything to do with the plain statement that he intended to be there when they came up. Dario came back through Elk City in June, going the other direction, Amarillo back toward Durant, and stopped at Rosie's because the coffee was good. Emmett was at his window table. Callie was at Emmett's feet before Dario had finished parking. He ate breakfast, and Emmett told him the kitchen garden had come in strong, and that the tomatoes especially were doing something worth watching. And Dario listened the way he'd learned to listen in the alley in February, without filling the silences, without moving ahead of what was being said. Just present in the specific way that makes a person feel that what they are saying is worth the time it takes to say it. Emmett looked at him across the table. "You asked me one question," he said. "That morning. Whether you'd eaten," Dario said. Emmett looked out the window at the street he'd grown up on, at the sign missing its apostrophe that no one had replaced in 30 years. "One question," he said. He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the manner of a man acknowledging the arithmetic of small things. There are moments that feel less like coincidence and more like arrangement. Dario had gotten into a truck that morning without a destination. He had stopped for coffee. Callie had stopped at an alley. He had followed her because he had learned over 3 years that following her was the thing to do. And in the alley, he had found a man who had the documents, who had kept everything, who knew what things cost without making them more or less than they were, and who had only needed someone to ask him a question that was simple enough to answer. He had simply asked. What Dario Vance did that February morning in Elk City, Oklahoma, was not extraordinary in the way we usually mean the word. He had the same hours anyone else had. He let his dog stop. He followed her into an alley. He sat on a milk crate in 11-degree wind and asked an old man whether he had eaten, and everything that followed from that. He simply asked one question. This story is for every Emmett, who kept everything, who knew what things cost, who made 2 months in an alley work because making things work was what he knew how to do, and who only needed someone to ask the right question at the right time. And for every person who has ever followed a dog into an alley because the dog knew something they didn't. Is there someone in your life, a parent, a grandparent, a neighbor, who you haven't asked one simple question lately? This week. Ask it this week. And if this story reminded you of someone who deserved to be asked and wasn't, leave their name below. This section is for them. Every story on this channel is about choosing not to look away. If that stays with you, subscribe. There are more, and you'll want to be here for every one. Which moment in this story will stay with you? I'll see you in the comments.